In today's political discourse, the environment and climate change are major discussion points, including in this year's presidential election so far. In the 1960s, the debate may not have had the same sense of urgency, but the effects of humans on their environment were not lost on President John F. Kennedy. In this episode, we'll hear from President Kennedy's granddaughter, Tatiana Schlossberg, about her new book on how our everyday decisions can have a major impact on the environment. And we'll also take a look at President Kennedy's own environmental legacy on this week's edition of JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Welcome to this week's episode of JFK 35, a podcast by the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. I'm Matt Porter. My co-host Jamie Richardson is off this week. Climate change and the environment have become household issues in the 2020 presidential campaign, with some candidates making it their primary focus. When President Kennedy took office, the environment was part of the political discussion, but it wasn't always front and center as it is today, with worldwide demonstrations protesting inaction over the global climate crisis. Still, President Kennedy had a strong affection for the environment and its protection. In 1962, he said in a statement from the White House, "I don't think there is anything that could occupy our attention with more distinction than trying to preserve for those who come after us this beautiful country we have inherited." In 1956, the National Park Service published a report on the increased development and rapid disappearance of unspoiled shorelines across America. Kennedy, an avid sailor and someone who has always had a deep connection to the sea, formed 3 national seashores to protect hundreds of miles of shoreline in Texas, California, and in his home state of Massachusetts. In his remarks on the founding of the Cape Cod National Seashore, the president said because the population is expected to double over the next half-century, it was more important than ever to protect parts of America's shoreline from overdevelopment. President Kennedy's view on protecting the environment was not a narrow focus on just the oceans, but he looked at the issue from all points. On March 1st, 1962, President Kennedy issued a special message to Congress on conservation where he said, "Our national conservation must include the complete spectrum of resources: air, water, and land, fuels, energy, and minerals, soils, forests, and forage, fish, and wildlife. Together, they make up the world of nature which surrounds us." And joining me now is Tatiana Schlossberg, who also took a holistic look at the climate crisis in her new book, Inconspicuous Consumption: The Environmental Impact You Don't Know You Have. In addition to being President Kennedy's granddaughter, Tatiana is an accomplished journalist who wrote about climate change and the environment for the New York Times. She has also been a contributor to The Atlantic and Bloomberg View. Tatiana, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so I'm going to get right to the question. The first one I want to ask is, what made you decide to write this book, particularly at this moment in time?
Well, I wanted to write the book because I felt I was a science and climate reporter at the New York Times, and I felt like there was a lot that was missing from the kind of larger journalistic coverage of climate change, and that was really the scale and the context that might make this issue more relevant and relatable for readers, because I think so often the scale of it hasn't made sense. You know, we have on the one hand plastic bottles, and on the other hand a complete transformation of the electricity grid in less than 10 years. And it felt to me like, you know, having that size of a scale made this issue seem so abstract and distant, and it already can feel so kind of far away in space and time. And so I wanted to try to ground it in the daily lives of readers, and also help them kind of understand why this issue is so complicated and difficult to solve.
Yeah, and I really got that reading the book. In fact, one of the first things that you talked about, you mentioned the plastic straw debate, you know, whether or not, you know, we should be getting rid of plastic straws. And you do mention that they are a problem, but sort of plastic straws are just the tip of the iceberg. You want to tell me a little bit about what you learned about from that debate?
Yeah, the tip of the slowly melting iceberg. You know, I think that the plastic, you know, most of us don't need to use straws, and so of course it's always good to be thinking about how we can lessen our consumption, and particularly our use of plastic, which is, you know, made from oil. But, you know, basically, if, you know, even if the highest estimates of plastic straws are on beaches and in oceans around the world. It's about 0.03% of all ocean plastic. And, about between 8 and 13 million tons of plastic get into the ocean every year. Most of it or a little less than half is fishing equipment. And so I think my concern about it is that it might let people feel like, okay, well, I got rid of my plastic straw, therefore I can, take a taxi. Or, and I also think, then we're thinking, oh, I didn't take a plastic straw, but what about the to-go lid and the cup that's lined with plastic and the creamer pod and the stirrer and all these other things. And I think I would like to see an emphasis more on kind of our to-go and convenience culture rather than just patting ourselves on the back about our straws.
Right. And, it's a bigger problem as you continue to talk about one of these things about things that we encounter in our daily life that I thought kind of struck me was you talked about Netflix. I like to go home and watch my Parks and Recreation nonstop for a couple hours. But Netflix, invisibly is polluting itself because of the internet and data centers. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that was really interesting for me to learn about just because I think like most people, I hadn't thought a lot about the physical infrastructure of the internet, but it is an enormous physical system that's, made up of cables and routers and modems all over the world. But also, in order to send and receive information, which we're doing all the time, it needs to be on. And so to be on, it needs to be powered by electricity. And, depending on where the data is stored that you're accessing at a particular moment in time, it could be powered by fossil fuels. And, especially since a lot of what people can read about in the book, which is that the history of the internet has kind of dictated that a lot of the infrastructure is in Northern Virginia, which is a place that runs on a lot of fossil fuels. And so even if a data center might be powered by renewable energy, if it's nighttime or it's not windy, they're going to resort to these dirtier backup fuels, which are fossil fuels. And also all of these data centers, in order to make sure that they are running, able to run all the time, that they don't have these service interruptions, they all have diesel generators to back it up. So I think it was a really powerful example for me of how we are all, whether we know it or not, we're all kind of participating in this system. I can be sitting in New York or in Boston and watching Parks and Recreation, and I'm creating the demand for fossil fuels to be burned in Virginia. And I think it was just a really, again, powerful example to me of how we're all kind of implicated in the system, and therefore we're all responsible for figuring it out. But, I think an important message that I try to get across in the book is that, yes, the things that we do every day and all of our stuff connects to this crisis of climate change, but that's not to say that we are individually, that we should feel individually guilty for climate change. I don't think we should feel individually guilty because I think that narrative of personal responsibility is destructive because it lets those who are actually responsible off the hook. But I do think we're collectively responsible for building a better world and creating better systems.
One of the one of the sections you chose to talk about was fashion, which I found really interesting. Why did you want to talk about the fashion industry when it comes to climate change and environmentalism?
Yeah, I think, similarly with the internet, it's something that doesn't immediately come to mind. The two other sections in the book are about food and fuel, which I think are more intuitive and something that people have thought a lot about and talked a lot about when it comes to climate change, but the internet and fashion in particular haven't come up as much. But fashion, it's an industry that touches animal agriculture, plant agriculture, petrochemicals, mining, forestry, shipping. It's kind of the engine of globalization in the same way that it was the engine of the Industrial Revolution, producing textiles. It's an enormous industry that millions and millions of people work in all over the world, and all of us interact with the system. And it is, I think we've kind of been complacent about the environmental impacts in a way that we're not so much with things like food. And I think it's, we just wear our clothes, we don't eat them. So we don't think quite as much about how they're made, but it's an incredibly polluting industry and incredibly energy intensive. And, there are all kinds of different labor violations and things like that all over the world. But I wanted to kind of illustrate some of the different environmental impacts of various materials, whether it was, the water used to grow cotton or how trees are cut down to make viscose rayon and things like that.
Right. And you talk a little bit about this fast fashion, which has maybe made things a little worse.
Yep. So that's companies like, I think probably most people are familiar with, like Zara or H&M, which kind of are cheap versions of kind of designer clothing, and they're really poorly made. They kind of replenish their stock like every 2 weeks or so. So there's just constantly new clothes that are coming in that people are buying because they seem cheap and they're sort of fashionable, but they fall apart pretty readily, and also they go out of style pretty quickly. So it's an enormous amount of energy and resources being used to create this stuff that, the average clothing is worn 7 times before it's thrown away. So we're really spending a lot of energy and resources and money on clothes that we don't even keep. And I think, there's a sense that these clothes are really cheap, and so therefore, it's easy to buy them. But I think, they're cheap because no one really pays for the ultimate cost of producing them, whether that's the energy or the resources or the water pollution or, the people whose health are affected by producing these clothes. And so, we think it's cheap because no one actually pays for the cost, or the companies that make these clothes don't pay for the cost, but we pay for it in terms of things like ecosystem health and clean water and healthcare costs and things like that.
One of the other industries I want to briefly touch on is the food industry. Mm-hmm. You talk a lot about when you tried to go through the grocery store yourself and be more sustainable, that was not easy. Tell me about that experience. Yeah,
I think having learned all the things that I've learned in writing this book, it can be paralyzing to go to the grocery store, just because in general, in all these different areas, it's really difficult as the consumer to kind of know what is the right decision to make and what's the more sustainable thing to do. And that's because, the companies that produce these, our food or our clothes, there's really not a lot of transparency about where things come from and how they're made. And so, I think with food, generally speaking, a lot of the things that we've heard are true, whether it's kind of eating red meat and, or just eating less animal products in general, that is better for the environment. But that's and it's partly because of the emissions from just raising livestock, but it's also because of this major industrial system that's kind of opaque to us as consumers as we're, trying to figure out what to eat.
And it's just a boggle of choices and trying to figure things out. The last question I want to touch on, we're here in John F. Kennedy Library. President Kennedy had a deep appreciation for the natural world. He established 3 national seashores to protect coastlines and oceans, promoted a youth conservation corps. Was there anything from your grandfather, President Kennedy, that his legacy on the environment that you've sort of been influenced by?
Well, I think, a lot of the work that he did in terms of inspiring Americans and asking people to get involved, I think we see that in the environmental movement that came up later in the 60s after his death. But I think, his call to service really resonated with that generation, and the laws and regulations that cleaned up our air and water and protected our natural resources are a result of that civic action. I also think, I was reading about all the work that the White House did, his administration did to support the work of Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, which was kind of the first a book that called attention to the dangers of pesticides in terms of birds and all other kinds of wildlife. And so, reading about that and how important it was to his administration and to him to support scientists. And, we're seeing even today that the Trump administration is not letting scientists use things like the health effects of air pollution in creating their regulations. So, to me, that was so important and inspiring and a really crucial for the government to take science into account when it's making decisions about our health and the environment.
Well said. Tatiana, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for writing the book.
Thank you for having me.
Take care. In 2007, we had a Kennedy Library forum about the work of marine biologist Rachel Carson during her centennial year. Carson's book about how the insecticide DDT was damaging the environment struck a chord with President Kennedy, who had not only read her book Silent Spring, but 2 others she wrote, including The Sea Around Us and The Edge of the Sea. On this week's episode page online, we will have a link to the transcript of the Carson Forum in 2007, as well as other documents and photos from the archives related to what we've discussed today, including President Kennedy's full remarks to Congress on conservation. Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. Stay with us next time as we bring you more stories from the JFK Library. If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or tweet at us at JFK Library using the hashtag JFK35. You can also follow us on Facebook and on Instagram. And if you liked what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review on iTunes. Thank you for listening and have a great week.